The film made it look effortless. A quiet nod, a subtle glance across a dimly lit room. Power distilled into silence. In Goodfellas, the world of organized crime was painted with precision. Fast money, sharper suits, and men who ruled without ever raising their voices. Among the shadows of that cinematic universe lingered the idea of an invisible king, a man who didn't need theatrics, a man who controlled everything without being seen. But the film never showed the truth behind that power. Because the real story of Carlo Gambino was not built on silence alone. It was built on patience, calculation, and a ruthless understanding of when not to act. Born in 1902 in the coastal town of Palermo, Sicily, Carlo Gambino entered a world already shaped by secrecy. Sicily at the turn of the century was a place where loyalty was currency and betrayal carried a death sentence. The mafia was not simply a criminal enterprise. It was a parallel system of order, one that thrived where the state was weak. Gambino's early years remain partially obscured, even in historical records. According to multiple documented accounts, he came from a family already connected to organized crime. Violence was not unfamiliar, but unlike many of his contemporaries, Gambino did not seek attention. He learned early that survival depended not on dominance, but on invisibility. By the early 1920s, the young Gambino had already aligned himself with powerful figures in Sicily's underworld. But the island was changing. Law enforcement pressure was increasing, and Benito Mussolini's regime had begun aggressively targeting mafia networks. For many, there was only one option left: America. In 1921, Carlo Gambino illegally entered the United States, slipping through the cracks of a system not yet prepared for the influx of organized crime that would follow. He arrived in New York, a city already teetering on the edge of transformation. Prohibition was about to begin, and with it, an empire of opportunity. New York in the 1920s was not controlled by a single force. It was fractured, divided among competing gangs, many of them Italian, Irish, and Jewish. Violence was constant. Alliances shifted overnight. Power was taken, not given. Gambino did not rush into this chaos. He embedded himself within it. He became associated with the Mangano crime family, one of the 5 major mafia families that would later define organized crime in the city. At the time, it was led by Vincent Mangano, a man known for strict adherence to traditional mafia codes. Gambino kept a low profile. He avoided unnecessary violence. He did not chase headlines. While others built reputations through bloodshed, Gambino built relationships. And he watched. The Castellamarese War erupted in 1930, a brutal conflict between 2 powerful factions, those loyal to Joe Masuria and those aligned with Salvatore Maranzano. The war reshaped the entire structure of organized crime in America. Bodies were left in the streets. Loyalty became a liability. But Gambino survived it, not by strength, by timing. According to investigators, Gambino aligned himself with rising figures like Lucky Luciano, who would ultimately dismantle the old guard and create a more structured, corporate-style mafia. The era of chaotic warfare gave way to something more organized, more controlled, more dangerous. Luciano's creation of the Commission, a governing body for the 5 families, changed everything. It introduced rules, boundaries, systems of conflict resolution that reduced open warfare. For men like Gambino, this new structure was ideal because it rewarded patience. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Gambino climbed steadily within the ranks. He was not flashy. He did not draw attention from law enforcement. His name rarely appeared in headlines. But within the organization, his influence grew. Investigators later discovered that Gambino had become deeply involved in lucrative operations: loan sharking, illegal gambling, and labor racketeering. These were not crimes that required violence to succeed. They required discipline, networks, control, and Gambino excelled at all 3. Meanwhile, the Mangano family itself began to fracture. Vincent Mangano's leadership style created tension within his own ranks. His underboss, Albert Anastasia, was a very different kind of figure: violent, unpredictable, and deeply feared. Known as the Lord High Executioner, Anastasia had built his reputation through enforcement, not diplomacy. The two men could not coexist. In 1951, Vincent Mangano disappeared. His body was never found. Shortly after, his brother Philip Mangano was discovered dead. The official explanation was internal conflict. The reality was far more deliberate. Anastasia seized control of the family, and Carlo Gambino stood beside him. To outsiders, it appeared that Gambino had aligned himself with one of the most dangerous men in the mafia. But the truth was more calculated. Gambino understood Anastasia's strengths and his weaknesses. Anastasia was feared, but fear created enemies. And enemies, over time, created opportunity. Throughout the 1950s, the mafia entered what many considered its golden era. Business was booming. The families operated with increasing sophistication. Corruption reached deep into unions, construction, and legitimate industries. But beneath the surface, tensions were building again. Anastasia's leadership became increasingly erratic. He sanctioned murders without approval. He disrupted the balance that the commission had worked to maintain. Other bosses began to see him not as an asset, but as a liability. According to multiple documented accounts, Carlo Gambino did not oppose Anastasia openly. He didn't need to. Instead, he waited. He strengthened alliances. He built quiet support among other powerful figures, including Vito Genovese, a man with ambitions of his own. Together, they recognized the same truth. Anastasia's power was unsustainable, but removing him would require precision. A public move would spark war. A miscalculation could collapse the entire structure of organized crime in New York. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and Gambino understood that better than anyone. Because unlike the men around him, Gambino was not driven by ego. He was driven by permanence. The plan, when it began to take shape, was not rushed. It unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. Conversations behind closed doors. Agreements made without witnesses. Loyalties tested in silence. The film never showed this part. It never showed the waiting. It never showed the quiet consolidation of power that happens long before a single shot is fired. By 1957, the decision had been made. Albert Anastasia had to be removed, but the method would define everything that followed. Because in the world Carlo Gambino was building, power would not come from fear alone. It would come from control, and control required a message. On the morning of October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia entered the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop in Manhattan. It was a routine appointment, a moment of vulnerability in a life otherwise defined by violence. He sat in the chair, relaxed, unaware. Moments later, two gunmen walked through the door. What happened next would not just eliminate a boss. It would reshape the entire mafia and place Carlo Gambino exactly where he had always intended to be, at the top. But the truth behind that assassination was far more calculated than anyone realized. And it had already begun long before Anastasia ever took that seat. According to multiple documented accounts, the assassination of Albert Anastasia was not a sudden decision. It was the final step in a carefully constructed operation, one that reflected the strategic mind of Carlo Gambino. The film never showed this level of planning, because in reality, nothing about that morning was accidental. In the months leading up to October 1957, alliances had shifted quietly across New York's underworld. Vito Genovese, who had long harbored ambitions of his own, saw an opportunity in Anastasia's growing instability. Anastasia's unpredictability had begun to threaten the delicate balance established by the commission. He approved hits without consultation. He disrupted agreements. He created fear, but not the kind that built loyalty. It was the kind that inspired betrayal. Gambino understood this better than anyone. He did not need to lead the opposition publicly. He allowed others, men like Genovese, to voice the concerns, to build the case, to create the justification. Gambino remained in the background, silent, observing. Investigators later discovered that this was his pattern. He never appeared at the center of conspiracies. His strength came from distance, from letting others take risks while he calculated outcomes. By mid-1957, the decision to eliminate Anastasia had been quietly approved by key figures within the commission. It was not framed as a power grab. It was framed as a correction. But the truth was far darker. Because while Genovese sought influence, Gambino sought control, and the removal of Anastasia would give him both. The logistics of the assassination required precision. Anastasia was not an easy target. He was heavily guarded, constantly alert, and known for reacting violently to perceived threats. A public attack risked failure, and failure would trigger war. So the plan focused on a moment of vulnerability. Routine, predictable, safe. The Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop provided exactly that. Anastasia had a habit of visiting the barbershop without his full security detail. It was one of the few places where he allowed himself to relax. A controlled environment, or so he believed. On the morning of October 25th, everything unfolded with clinical efficiency. Anastasia arrived shortly before 10:15 a.m. He greeted the staff, removed his coat, and sat down in the barber's chair. A white cape was draped over him, restricting his movement. His bodyguards, unusually, were not at his side. Some accounts suggest they were deliberately delayed. Others indicate they had been instructed to wait outside. Either way, Anastasia was alone. Moments passed, then the door opened. Two men entered. They were not recognized by the staff. They wore scarves, partially concealing their faces. One positioned himself near the entrance. The other moved forward. There was no warning, no conversation, just gunfire. Witnesses later described the scene as instantaneous chaos. Bullets shattered mirrors. The sound echoed through the room, deafening in the confined space. Anastasia, reacting on instinct, attempted to rise, but the cape entangled him, restricting his movement. In a final act of reflex, he lunged toward the attackers. But it was already over. His body collapsed against the barber's chair, riddled with bullets. Blood spread across the tile floor, and within seconds, the gunmen were gone. The entire operation lasted less than a minute, but its impact would reshape organized crime in America. The film never showed the aftermath. It never showed how quickly the narrative was controlled. Within hours, rumors spread through the city. Some blamed internal disputes. Others pointed to rival factions. Law enforcement struggled to piece together the truth. There were no immediate arrests, no clear suspects, because the people responsible had ensured that no direct links could be traced. This was not a chaotic hit. It was a message, and everyone in the mafia understood it. Anastasia, once one of the most feared men in the country, had been eliminated in a setting where he felt safest. The implication was clear. No one was untouchable, not even at the top. Within days, Carlo Gambino assumed control of the family. There was no public announcement, no ceremony, just a quiet transition of power that reflected his entire approach to leadership. Where Anastasia ruled through fear, Gambino ruled through control. He reorganized operations immediately. He reduced unnecessary violence. He strengthened relationships with other families. And most importantly, he reinforced the authority of the commission. But this was not an act of cooperation. It was consolidation. Investigators later discovered that Gambino's leadership marked a shift in how organized crime operated. He avoided public attention at all costs. He discouraged flamboyance. He prioritized profit over reputation. Under his control, the former Mangano family became what would later be known as the Gambino crime family, and it quickly became the most powerful criminal organization in the United States. But power, in Gambino's world, did not look like it did in the movies. There were no dramatic displays, no public threats, just quiet expansion. He extended influence into construction, shipping, and labor unions. He developed international connections, particularly in narcotics trafficking, despite publicly opposing it. He maintained strict discipline within his ranks, and he enforced one critical rule: visibility was weakness. This philosophy allowed Gambino to operate for years without significant law enforcement interference. While other bosses attracted attention through violence or extravagance, Gambino remained almost invisible. But the truth was far more dangerous, because his influence reached further than anyone realized. According to federal investigations, Gambino had indirect control over multiple industries. His organization infiltrated unions, manipulated contracts, and influenced legitimate businesses at a scale that blurred the line between crime and commerce. Yet his name rarely appeared in headlines. This was not accidental. It was strategy. However, beneath this controlled exterior, new tensions were forming. Because Gambino's rise had not gone unnoticed, other figures within organized crime began to question the balance of power. Some saw Gambino's methods as effective. Others saw them as restrictive. His emphasis on discipline limited opportunities for those who thrived on aggression. And among these figures was a man who would later become one of the most infamous names in mafia history, John Gotti. At the time, Gotti was still a rising figure, ambitious, charismatic, and very different from Gambino. Where Gambino valued silence, Gotti thrived on visibility. Where Gambino avoided attention, Gotti seemed to invite it. The contrast between the two represented a deeper divide within the organization. Old world versus new, control versus spectacle. And over time, that divide would become impossible to contain. But Gambino, as always, remained patient. He continued to expand his influence quietly. He avoided unnecessary conflict. He maintained order within the commission. And for years, his strategy worked. Law enforcement struggled to build cases against him. Witnesses were scarce. Evidence was limited. His name remained distant from the crimes he orchestrated. It appeared as though Gambino had achieved something unprecedented. Total control without exposure. But the truth was far darker, because the same system that protected him was beginning to fracture from within. By the late 1960s, federal agencies had begun intensifying their focus on organized crime. Surveillance increased. Informants became more valuable. The structure that had once ensured secrecy was now under pressure from multiple directions. And for the first time in decades, cracks began to appear, not in Gambino's authority, but in the loyalty of those beneath him. Because power built on silence depends on one thing above all else: absolute obedience. And the moment that obedience falters, everything begins to unravel. The turning point came quietly, without gunfire, without witnesses. But its consequences would be far more destructive than any assassination. Because for the first time in his career, Carlo Gambino was no longer the one controlling the outcome. Because for the first time in his career, Carlo Gambino was no longer the one controlling the outcome. The shift was not immediate. It did not announce itself with violence or spectacle. There were no bodies left in the streets, no sudden war between families. Instead, it emerged slowly, almost invisibly, within the very structure Gambino had spent decades perfecting. According to multiple documented accounts, the late 1960s marked a turning point not just for the Gambino crime family, but for organized crime across the United States. Law enforcement had changed. For years, the mafia had operated under the assumption that silence was protection, that witnesses would never speak, that internal codes, omerta, were stronger than any legal system. But investigators were adapting. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began prioritizing long-term surveillance operations. Wiretaps, informants, and coordinated federal cases started replacing the reactive policing of earlier decades. The government was no longer chasing individual crimes. It was targeting entire organizations. And for the first time, the mafia's greatest strength, its secrecy, became its greatest vulnerability. Gambino understood this shift. He reduced exposure even further. He avoided meetings that could be monitored. He insulated himself through layers of intermediaries. Orders were passed indirectly. Conversations became fragmented. He was still in control, but control now required distance. Investigators later discovered that this distance created unintended consequences. Communication became slower. Misinterpretations increased. And most critically, loyalty began to weaken, not out of rebellion, but out of disconnection. The men beneath Gambino were no longer operating under direct oversight. They were operating on assumption. An assumption, in organized crime, is dangerous. During this period, another factor began to reshape the internal dynamics of the mafia: generational change. The old guard, men like Gambino, have been shaped by Sicily, by tradition, by strict codes of conduct. They valued discretion. They avoided unnecessary violence. They believed that power was strongest when it remained unseen. But a new generation was emerging. American-born, less bound by old-world traditions, more willing to take risks. Among them was John Gotti. Gotti's rise within the organization was not immediate, but it was steady. He operated primarily in Queens, building influence through hijacking operations and street-level enforcement. Unlike Gambino, Gotti did not avoid attention. He cultivated it. Expensive suits, public appearances, a presence that stood in direct contrast to the quiet authority Gambino embodied. To some within the family, Gotti represented a new kind of leadership, bold, visible, and unapologetic. To others, he represented a threat. But during Gambino's lifetime, that threat remained contained. Because Gambino still controlled the structure, he appointed trusted figures to key positions. One of the most significant decisions came in the early 1970s, when he elevated Paul Castellano within the organization. Castellano was not a traditional street enforcer. He was a businessman, focused on white-collar crime, construction, and corporate infiltration. It was a decision that reflected Gambino's vision. Crime as enterprise, profit over violence. But it also deepened the divide within the family. Because many of the younger, more aggressive members saw Castellano as disconnected from the realities of street-level operations. They viewed his leadership style as detached, even weak, and they began to question the direction of the organization. Gambino, as always, did not respond publicly. He maintained order through quiet authority, but time was no longer on his side. By the mid-1970s, Carlo Gambino's health had begun to decline. Years of operating in the shadows had taken their toll. He withdrew further from daily operations, relying increasingly on his inner circle to maintain control. The structure still held, but it was no longer as stable as it appeared. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died at his home on Long Island. There was no dramatic end, no arrest, no public downfall, just silence. In many ways, it was consistent with the life he had lived, controlled, calculated, and largely unseen. But the truth was far darker, because Gambino's death did not mark the end of his influence. It marked the beginning of its collapse. According to investigators, the transition of power that followed exposed the fragility of the system Gambino had built. Paul Castellano officially became the new boss of the family, as Gambino had intended. But authority without universal respect is unstable, and Castellano did not command the same loyalty. The divide between the old guard and the new generation widened rapidly. Street-level crews felt marginalized. Decisions were made without consultation. Profits were redistributed in ways that created resentment. And at the center of that growing tension was John Gotti. The film never showed this fracture. It never showed how quickly control can dissolve once the man holding it is gone. By the early 1980s, the internal conflict had reached a breaking point. Castellano's leadership was increasingly challenged, not openly, but through quiet defiance. Orders were ignored. Alliances shifted. The structure Gambino had spent decades refining was beginning to unravel. And just as Gambino had once recognized the weakness in Anastasia, Gotti recognized the weakness in Castellano. The parallels were impossible to ignore. A boss seen as disconnected, a growing coalition of opposition, a moment of vulnerability waiting to be exploited. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano arrived outside Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan. He never made it inside. Gunmen emerged from the shadows and opened fire, killing him in one of the most public assassinations in mafia history. Witnesses later described the scene as brazen, deliberate in its visibility. This was not Gambino's style. This was something new, and it sent a different kind of message. Power no longer needed to be silent. John Gotti assumed control of the family shortly after, but his leadership would prove to be everything Gambino had avoided. Visible, confrontational, exposed, Gotti's rise attracted intense media attention. He became known as the Dapper Don, a figure who seemed to embrace the spotlight rather than avoid it. For a time, it appeared as though his approach was successful. He evaded convictions. He projected confidence. But investigators had already adapted. The same federal strategies that had begun during Gambino's later years were now fully operational. Surveillance intensified. Informants became central to prosecutions. And the culture of silence that had once protected the mafia began to erode. The turning point came from within. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on multiple charges, including murder and racketeering, largely due to testimony from former associates who chose cooperation over loyalty. The code had been broken, and once broken, It cannot be restored. Investigators later concluded that this shift, more than any single arrest, marked the true downfall of the mafia's traditional power structure. Because without silence, there was no control, and without control, there was no empire. Looking back, the story of Carlo Gambino is often misunderstood. The image of a quiet, untouchable boss, operating above the chaos, has been reinforced by films like Goodfellas. But the truth was never that simple. Gambino did not avoid violence. He controlled it. He did not disappear. He positioned himself where he could not be easily reached. And he did not build an empire that would last forever. He built one that depended entirely on his presence. Because when Carlo Gambino died, the silence he had perfected died with him. And what followed was not a continuation of his power, but the slow, inevitable collapse of everything he had spent a lifetime creating.